I would just like to start off by saying that I heard on KEXP that Madness released One Step Beyond in 1979. And I don't know if there's any other ska fans out there, but I grew up on this music. And so also on this day, the Specials debuted their premiere album, The Specials, and Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers all also released Damn the Torpedoes. It was quite a day on October 19th, 1979. I don't know if there's anyone out there as old as I am, but the influences of that music have affected me my whole life. So any case, I'm using this app called Roam, and it's a way for me just to take notes and everything else. And I think this discussion that I was thinking about having today was kind of a mix of some results that we've seen from our own research, but also kind of some stories that I've heard along the way from people who are in open source and what they've had to say. And so let me just talk, the first thing I would like to do is to hear about who we have here in the audience. And so can you just kind of, if you're in the chat, can you tell me who you are and what you do and what a little bit about your own story? I'd love to hear it. Okay. We have Christian Broman, who's a senior software engineer at the open source program office at Sauce Labs. Hi, Christian. Great to have you here. Who else do we have today? If you could just let us know in the chat, I'd love to hear from you. There has to be. I know that there's people out there. I see 30 participants. And so, all right. Hey, it's Paige McKenzie, a data scientist at NetApp, interested in open source, but yet to contribute. All right. And we have Susan Legendre McGee, who is senior software engineer at Red Hat. We have Ravi Ranyan, who is from IBM, an architect for digital commerce. We have Sudhir, who is from software engineer at NetApp on the open source team. Kirk Carlson, who is a panelist and attendee, who is a retired telecom engineer. We have Ricardo Fora, and is an associated software engineer from the healthcare cloud team at Optum. Joining in from Minneapolis, we have Vincent Segranis. And Vincent is a chief architect at Red Hat. Vincent, great to have you here. Michael Downey, who runs the open source program at the United Nations Foundation. Wonderful to have you here, Michael. What a group. Paige McKenzie. Paige is a senior full stack cloud engineer at MobileSmith, specializing in MobileSmith Health, specializing in healthcare technologies, contribute to the FHIR Kit open source project for former company Vermonster. And Mindy Effinger, who is a software engineer at Salesforce looking to get into open source. Well, I have a good list. I'll keep listening to people here, and I love questions. I am maybe sometimes not as knowledgeable as I'd like to be, but I'll give it my best try. And I have a presentation. It's really focused on the research results from our open source project. But I thought first thing I would do is talk a little bit about the new stack and what we do here at the new stack. And I just, first of all, to tell you a little bit about myself. I am a journalist by trade. I began my career at a daily newspaper in Augusta, Georgia, with an internship prior to that in Salem, Oregon. But my first real job was as a daily newspaper reporter in Augusta, Georgia. And I think that in that time, I learned a lot about the meaning of open source, but mostly from the perspective of a journalist in seeking the freedom of information, because it was in our view that the only way we could ever kind of get some idea of what is actually happening in this world is by doing the reporting. And a lot of that was about the freedom of information that you really needed to have. So there were times where I had to fill out freedom of information requests for information because the government organizations just wouldn't provide it. But it was really this, I think many journalists are very similar to engineers because they seek this level of openness. They want it to be open. They want to explain things. They want to know what's going on. They want to help people understand things better. And so when I think though of my work and of open source, I also think about, who I am and what I love and my family and my friends and what I need to do to be secure in my life and what I need to do to make sure that I'm supporting myself and the loved ones around me. And I think that's very true of open source and the opportunity in open source in particular. It's really about, what I find more from people all the time when I talk to them, it's about their own compass and what drives them. What makes it them to want to get up in the morning? What is it that makes it really feel like, hey, I can do something here. I can make a difference. And it's really kind of in that drives the work we do at the New Stack. And if you're not familiar with us, we focus on explanation and analysis of at-scale development, deployment, and management. And we cover a lot of open source projects. What we're trying to do is not really be beholden to the news, but keeping tabs on it and following it. Because what often happens is, what I'm sure if you see in the news world, it just becomes an inundation. And you really don't have much control over that inundation. And it becomes, I think, a little bit of a swamp even for the people who are journalists, because they are trying to always keep up. And that's just almost impossible now. What really matters now is, for us at least, is trying to explain the news and helping understand it and getting a better idea of what's happening when we're thinking about, for instance, at-scale development, deployment, and management. So, so I'm going to just see if I can turn on my Zoom camera yet, because I am not actually able to do this. I'm going to stop share, see if that works. Nope, still not working. So I'm going to share my screen again. I'll go back to my Roam research. I don't know if anyone else is familiar with Roam, but it allows you to keep a daily diary of just news that you're coming around or notes that you want to take. And it keeps it in a graph index. And so it's a very helpful tool for me. A lot of the focus that we're going to have right now in this conversation is about the survey results that we did for our open source project that we do every year with the Linux Foundation. We've done it the past 3 years, and I'm just going to pull up the Prezzo, and I'm going to share it. And it should load up in just a second. And I'm going to get to some of these stories in a minute, but I thought I would just start with, with just a little bit of a summary of the report itself. So one thing that I would like to do is to discuss really what we were trying to do with the project. I'm going to go to another, I'm going to go to the GitHub project. Let me just try to move this around. I'm going to stop the share, and then I'm going to go to back to Chrome, and and I'm going to pull up again the Roam research, and we're going to go right into the survey results here on GitHub. Now, the work that we did with the Linux Foundation is all here and available for you on GitHub. And I think it shows kind of the results that we've had from the past several years. We've done it, we started in 2018, And now here we are looking at the results for 2020. We can look at the results just very quickly in the GitHub project. We can look at some of the key findings. We had more than 1,000 people participate in the survey. It was conducted from May 5th to June 15th of this year. The respondents were working with large companies with more than 10,000 employees. You guys can read this. I'm going to go right to the survey itself and just kind of show you some of the key findings. One of the things that we did see this year is that there weren't as many. It was a bit slower in terms of people's responses. We weren't seeing as many people responding this year as we had in the past years, and we're not really certain what that's about. But I think that with everyone home now, with COVID-19 and restrictions in place, it's changing behaviors a bit. We're not. We don't have any kind of clear delineation why that is, but I just want to be upfront with that. As we all know, that there is a widespread adoption of open source data. When we started, we didn't have empirical data to support open source program creation, but over the past 3 years, the survey data has been largely consistent, providing a baseline for measuring change and for measuring the growth that we've had. Open source is more popular than ever before, and it's set to drive in economic conditions. One of the things that we do see is that the larger companies are now investing heavily in open source. And so if you're at all interested in building and getting into open source, there's a lot of proof here in our study that shows that that we are seeing a real blossoming of open source in larger organizations. And one of the takeaways that we get from that is, like, if you're looking to get into open source, there's that ability to really kind of almost like to learn it, to be there as a student. This is where a lot of the open source projects are strongest. And just want to make sure that everyone can see my screen here.
Hi, Alex. So
Yeah.
I'll see your screen, and I just made you a co-host of this meeting, so that would help with your video as well.
Okay. Okay, so am I sharing now still?
Not yet. Yes, we can see you now. Your video is on.
Okay. And so I'm just getting kind of back to the slide presentation itself. I'm going to I'll share it with my screen again.
All good. We can see it now.
Okay, so now you can see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. So what we saw is that that when we started this, as I was saying, we have seen a solid baseline for measuring change, growth, and effectiveness, and into the future. These results do show that we're kind of at an in-between time, I think, in the open source world, where we're seeing some kind of like stabilization in the data. And so I think you'll see that when we move forward. When you do look at the data, you can see a few things: that open source contributions, collaboration, and new projects are on the rise in enterprise settings. consumers, open source code and product or services. We're seeing not much of a change across the board. We're still kind of seeing at most the creation of new projects. And that's a good sign for us. I mean, that means that we're seeing much more participation and development of open source projects. And one of the patterns that we see is how open source organizations will adopt open source initially. They'll see some uptick in interest. They'll start to see more people start consuming open source. They'll start to see people then actually starting to contribute to open source projects. And it starts to really then show results when there are actual open source projects that they're building out. We see this time and time again. I think of stories from companies like Box, who developed open source projects because they were part of the Kubernetes Foundation and the Kubernetes project, and they saw a need to open source some of their technology. We see this increasingly also as a market opportunity for companies that are building out their own projects by contributing to open source projects in themselves. The other thing is the increasing influence of maintainers and their role in the community. We're doing a demo. We're doing a lightning demos tomorrow with five open source project leaders in the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. And these are people who all have had very interesting careers because they've risen to this job as a maintainer, and a lot of it through doing just that very hard work that starts with just what they say, just basically carrying the water, so to speak, and doing all the work that needs to get done. Any questions that we can have that we have to start here? I want to make sure that I'm getting into things. Great. One of the things that I would like to, just like to share kind of at these points is talking about different people who I've seen reflect on the results that we show here. And one of those people is Mitchell Hashimoto, who you will know as one of the founders of HashiCorp. And Mitchell's story is one that is just fascinating because, here's Mitchell. When I did a Q&A with him in 2015, and he was 25 at the time. And at the time he said something that I thought that was pretty interesting. He basically talked about how open source projects have changed really so much when he was just starting out. When he was just starting out, he was there to learn he was learning Visual Basic. He was 12 years old. Now we all know that Visual Basic is not an open source language, but at the time, Mitchell was just trying to figure out just the most basics of things. He was trying to understand, how he could actually make things parse. And he was able to do that because the people in the community there shared the open source code. Now, one of the things that is changed is how much open source now is just so popular, and how it's become so important to to the community overall, to the point then that now today, what we're seeing a lot of open source is now much more of a business exercise. And it almost is as if like the career path for people, is to start your own open source project, which can help lead you to a job, but it's also participating in the project and getting involved in the open source projects. And this is, I think what Mitchell is saying is that because the market has changed so much, that this is where the opportunity is. It's with these companies where open source is so important. He said, this was in 2015, I think it's pretty prescient. All that still exists today, but a lot of open source, especially open source that I'm involved in today, is viewed as high stakes open source. People feel like it has to have an impact. They feel pressure with their open source for some reason. It wasn't about that then. I mean, there were bad things because it wasn't about that. You would just put up the zip file with your source. You would never touch that again. But it was more about, here's how you do this thing so that you can do it in the future. It was a lot more about learning than trying to build some core part of someone's infrastructure or software. So that says to me that really, if you're looking for a career in open source, you know, what is very relevant today is the strength of these organizations and the roles that they play in building out open source projects. Let's go to here. Okay, when you look at open source projects, what you do see is that most of the open source you still see is for the commercial, for internal purposes. We see that in the numbers here. They want to use it in their commercial projects. But what we are starting to see is, again, this uptick in open source users who are contributing code upstream at times. Now, when you think about those projects, they are often being done to help train developers in open source. And so this is why we see, you know, the value of like actually participating in open source projects as a way to learn to learn what to learn more about what you can do. And it reminds me too of another person who we interviewed, and you may know his name. Let me pull up this article about the founder of Drupal. And you know, I can pull this up here, and you know, I'll provide all the links to you later. But Dries Buytaert, he founded Drupal right at the .com bust, and that was in 2008, as we all know, at the start of that so-called Great Recession. He started Acquia, a digital experience platform for Drupal sites, and so he really built his project on really on the backs of the recession. And so if you're looking at kind of developing your open source project, this is something maybe to think about, where you can actually begin to think about open source projects as a way to help other companies or help your own work and help move forward. He was convinced that open source software was recession proof, and I think we're seeing that a bit in our data too. And so, you know, again, Buytaert, you probably all know Drupal to some extent. It grew like crazy in 2008, 2009, and it was just primarily because it cost less. And I think that's one of the reasons what we see here in the data ourselves is it just costs less to build on open source. There's also the better chance that the open source tool will survive. You know, instead of going bankrupt, like you know, like you can see with a lot of proprietary platforms. I think this is one of the kind of the dangers that we see with SaaS platforms. And if the SaaS companies don't do so well, but all your data is locked up in there. This is why open source is becoming so much more critical, I think, overall, to not just to engineers, but to overall society. So those are some of the reasons that we're seeing kind of an interest in open source overall. And I think Dries is a good example of someone who really has made an impact, but also shows why open source during these times like this are so important. One of the things that Dries talks about is like, if you're looking for a job and looking for work, is to just start doing little things like documentation work on open source projects. looking around and seeing what you can just do to help. And I think there's kind of some lessons there for the people who are watching this presentation, that if you have the permissions internally and you have the ability, the actual work on those open source projects can actually help you out quite a bit, can help bring that learning back to the company. When we look at these open source projects inside companies, one thing that we see is that that companies that are developing these open source program offices, maybe fewer than overall what we see generally in the market. But what they do provide is a framework for how you can develop open source projects. And one of the things that we do see is that they really focus on 4 areas. They work on creating policies that will increase adoption. They promote open source culture. They improve license compliance, and they guide corporate citizenship within open source communities. We see this quite a bit from some of the larger organizations out there who are well trained and well organized around open source projects. Well, if you look at the Kubernetes community in particular, there's a lot of people there who have a lot of experience. They've been able to build out their own personas, really, that really carries into the open source culture of their own organization, but also carries through into the communities themselves. One of the things we see is that open source is maturing to some extent, and what it's doing is showing that open source and its roots are really in compliance. That's where we see a lot of open source program offices roots, and not open source, but open source program offices have their roots in compliance. And we see this this time and time again in our study. Now, back in 2018, this wasn't such the case, but now it's becoming much more important. And I think we'll see the continuation of that. But I think the people in this audience will understand is that open source program offices are really managed by the engineering groups, and the actual policy itself is dictated in many respects by the licensing issues and the legal requirements, but the actual projects themselves are run by engineering. And so it's engineering really who is at the forefront. And so really when you think about that, that's why developing and delivering open source training, resources, and documentation is critically important. Why we're seeing the need, for launching new open source projects can come when you have that training and the resources in place. We do see some differences in how people perceive open source. We saw a drop in the facilitating effective use of open source in commercial products and services, and owning and overseeing execution of open source strategy. So we've seen kind of this effect where the commercial products are important, but almost more important in many respects is the compliance, but also in many respects the culture itself, and helping build the culture so more developers can be recruited. We're seeing that companies are planning to create an open source program offices. It's what we see here is that when they do want to start a program office initiative, the formal programs are preferred over informal ones. It's important to see that these organizations often form in IT or software engineering groups. They have a narrower focus, again, with fewer programs aiming to accomplish developer hiring, open source contributions, or community influence. I think when we see how these projects emerge, we see that they again are they come from a need. And for instance, if you look at a company like VMware, and when we look at VMware, they're a company that has come a long way with their open source project efforts. I'd like to see if we can just go to, to one of the stories that we were that we wrote resulting from this work we did. Here, let's see here. I'm going to go into Rome. This is a story that we recently ran. Actually, we ran it in August. What we see here, I think, is evident in the results that we show, is that the open source reputations of companies are on the rise. Of many companies on the rise because of their open source efforts. We saw this in particular again with Microsoft. We've seen this in particular with other companies too. VMware worked with us on this research, and you can see here how Red Hat top.
Alex,
Yeah.
you don't see your screen? Are we supposed to see one?
You can't see it?
No.
I just shared it. Let me see it again. Let me see here. Let me share my screen again then. All right. Sorry about that. What we have seen is that in backing up kind of the data that we've been showing here about how building open source programs is more important to companies, and how open source program offices play a role in that. I think one thing that we saw is that VMware has particularly shown that in its development of its open source program office. And really in the work that they've done in terms of focusing more on open source, and like a lot of the other companies that does come through acquisition. We worked again with with Linux Foundation, the To-Do group on this study, and I think one of the things we see here is that Red Hat did top the ratings as in their perception of as an open source organization, but Google, IBM, and Microsoft also got high marks for engagement. We looked at these companies just to as trying to provide a kind of a broad view of the market. They're mostly technology companies, or actually all technology companies. I mean, Comcast is a telecom company, as is Verizon, but they all have a big stake in open source projects. Red Hat has been, as we well know, has been synonymous with open source. We see that 58% of people rated it as excellent, and another 24% as above average. IBM acquired Red Hat, as we all know, and so this has definitely helped IBM's reputation and helped to kind of pair itself, with the strong efforts that IBM has had in its own open source projects. Microsoft's acquisition of GitHub is another example, and shows that, again, that acquisitions play a big role in helping your open source project efforts. I think that's very much true of VMware as well. They went from 43% to 53% in 2020 in terms of respondents rating as citizenship at or above average. And that, I think, again, is people just know a lot more about VMware's open source project efforts. VMware did acquire Pivotal and Bitnami. Pivotal, in particular, has played a big role in the open source development efforts. There have also been, Joe Beta and Craig McCluskey, who are leading the VMware open source efforts. They came from an acquisition, and so now we're seeing their work really start to unfold. Pivotal has a team of very accomplished engineers, and what I am starting to see, just from my own personal anecdote, is that more people are joining VMware who have strong open source backgrounds. I interviewed, for instance, an engineer from VMware 2 weeks ago who has worked a lot on some very interesting projects that relate to SmartNICs and service, and has a lot of interesting perspectives on SmartNICs and service mesh technologies. And so we see this coming through pretty loud and clear. Here's the overall open source citizenship ratings for companies. We are starting to see that a lot of these companies are participating more in foundations, and particularly the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. We're seeing an increase in that work, going from 32 to 37% in terms of the studies and what their respondents organizations were. That's partly related to upstream contributions and more organizations making efforts compared to several years ago. We're seeing that that a lot of these organizations also have formal policy governing contributions to upstream open source projects. Now, just this is just more about the methodology that we followed here. Let me go back to the slides. I'll stop share for a second here, and I'll go back into the slides themselves. And we'll share that. Some of the results show for us on open source developers has dropped for existing open source program offices. Increased developer recruitment and retention is a benefit for existing open source programs. And that actually has gone down in the past few years. This is likely due to economic conditions. Companies are not hiring and maybe even having layoffs. And so, again, it shows a little bit of a drop, but I also think that this is the areas where we're going to see more investment in terms of open source overall. There has been a drop in frequently recruiting and hiring developers to work on open source projects. Again, this is for us, it looks like an example of what's happening in the economy. But still, finding and recruiting developers is among the top 3 challenges for existing open source program offices. Now, that's again showing a big drop there of 9%, 38% to 27%. There's still these open source program offices that we're still optimistic about their funding amid economic changes. I don't know if there's anyone here who can attest to this, who can say whether this is true or not. This study results were prepared a little bit earlier in the year, and things are quite dynamic now. But we're seeing still the much more higher importance of open source projects overall. So we'll have to see where this data goes. We have about 3 minutes left, and I don't want to use up too much more of the time here. If there's any questions that people have, but we can just go quickly through some of the benefits for existing programs in 2020. Number one is innovation, awareness of open source and commercial dependencies, increased participation in external open source projects, better license compliance, and more influence in open source communities. After doing this study 3 years in a row, we see kind of this circular effect where it really is, where initially there was focus on compliance. Now the focus has turned still to be on compliance, but there is now the need, there's realization that open source projects play a big part in how companies are going to build out. Their commercial dependencies they're much more aware of that in terms of their commercial dependencies. And they are showing that in their external projects that they're participating in. Some of the challenges that open source programs face is insufficient budgets, program costs, executive awareness and support. Sometimes it feels like the open source program offices are a bit like knowledge management organizations, and they just don't have the profile. They're more like think tanks than anything else. But again, it comes back to the culture, and I think it comes back to what I originally was talking about. It's what matters to the individual, what matters to what they believe in, and that then is really pulled through with the culture of the organization. And with cultures with strong open source communities, you see a lot of different results of that. You see it in the products, you see it in their participation in conferences, you see it in their participation overall in projects and their direction. One of the things I would like to just finish with, though, is a little bit about what we've seen over the past several months, in particular, in projects where the organizations have changed a bit culturally, and how that has affected actually the open source projects in the community. And this is something that I would love to see open source project offices think about more and talk more about, and how the influences on their own organization affect the open source projects overall. We saw this in particular with Istio and the Istio project, and what's happened in that community with with Google's role there changing. And we're going to start seeing it more and more with other projects too. And so the open source program offices, I think, have a challenge here that they really need to be thinking more about what role they play in their internally, so they can have a stronger role and affecting not just their own corporate interests, but the people who they represent. And those are the users and the contributors in the market. Thank you. I appreciate your time. I'm Alex Williams, founder and publisher of the New Stack. Sorry a little bit for the goofs here and such. We didn't have the video, but in trying to just get Zoom to work in the right way is definitely my challenge for me. But thank you very much, and I appreciate it.
All right, thank you very much, Alex, for being here with us at ATO, All Things Open 2020. And where can they reach you? Yes, we have your email here, phone number, perfect. So for everyone, do you have any questions? If not, you can actually reach out to Alex even after this event. And any questions so far?
I just want to thank people for introducing themselves. It's always nice to see who's there. So thank you for everyone who was there participating. And I'll post these links somewhere. Maybe I'll put them up on Twitter But we'll make sure that they're available.
All right, and your Twitter is at Alex Williams.
At Alex Williams.
Perfect. All right, and from Vincent, thank you, he said.
Wonderful. Thank you, Vincent. Thank you, everyone. I am always interested in hearing from people about their own experiences with open source. So please feel free to reach out to me. And I'm here to help. And I just love this community so much and helping explain and understand it. So thank you for all your time here.